What's up, guys? Welcome back. Today, we are covering one of the most insane collapses in modern history. Not one battle, not one invasion, not one nuclear apocalypse. A superpower just collapsed. The Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics went from we will bury capitalism to please somebody buy bread in basically 6 years. And what went wrong? What was the scary thing? Nobody expected it. Not even the CIA, not the KGB, and potentially even less. Not even many Soviet citizens themselves. And this is the story of why the Soviet Union collapsed, what brought about the end of the Cold War, and why one name that goes by the name of Gorbachev accidentally detonated the entire system from the inside, even if this perhaps wasn't his intention. His intention was to save the Soviet system in some way and to practically pretty much do the opposite. And if you understand this topic properly, you can absolutely dominate this question if it comes up in Cambridge 9489 paper 4, because this topic is perfect for cause, consequence, change, continuity, and significance, which is exactly what the exam board wants. If you like this video, please appreciate it by dropping a like, a share, and a subscribe. And without further ado, let's get right into it. Why was the USSR already weak? The Soviet Union in the early 1980s looked powerful. Huge army. Nuclear weapons. Eastern Europe was under the control of the Red Soviet Empire. Space achievements, global influence. But what was looming underneath the carpet? Rotting. Complete rotting. You might have heard historians, and also when you learned this topic at school, this topic being described as literally the USSR being in stagnation and in a state of paralysis. And this is the first massive high level indicator point. The USSR did not suddenly collapse one morning because of Gorbachev. It was already structurally weak. And that's a very important point to write down, I would say so, in your notes, because the Soviet economy was terrible. Factories produced garbage nobody wanted. Shops were empty. Technology lagged behind the West. Agriculture was inefficient. Corruption was everywhere. People even blatantly joked about the government constantly. Perhaps very important. People used to complain privately, but under glasnost, they suddenly saw criticism openly on television. And that matters because the regime lost ideological control. And once fear disappears, authoritarian systems become extremely vulnerable. This is a huge point. And also, while Soviet refrigerators were shoddy, they were obsessed over an arms race with the United States that the Soviet Union arguably could never win. And the USSR was entering uncharted territory, really, it could be argued. Because how can you, with such a stagnant and paralyzed system, and where basically they were on the point of please somebody buy bread, work in the higher, more advanced domains of like the higher, more advanced domains of the space race and stockpiling nuclear weapons and that sort of thing. All right, so then comes Mikhail Gorbachev. He's young, energetic, and different. Not another old, ancient prehistoric relic, but he understood something critical. The USSR could not survive unchanged. So he launches two gigantic reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika. You need these perfectly for the exam. Glasnost essentially means openness, less censorship, more freedom of speech. People can criticize the government. While Perestroika is more about restructuring, less state control, economic reform, some private business activity. You could literally see ordinary citizens operating small businesses and feeling independent from the state in this era in the Soviet Union. Now, here is the problem. Gorbachev wanted to save socialism, but his reforms destroyed the mechanism that kept socialism fundamentally alive. This is the core paradox. He loosened control, but the system was dependent on control. And the A-star analytical line that I would warmly encourage you to include here is something along the lines of Gorbachev attempted to reform communism without fully abandoning it, but partial reform destabilized the structures that had previously maintained Soviet authority. That sentence alone is literally almost examiner bait. Now, the next disaster, the explosion of nationalism. The USSR was not just Russia. It was Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and many more republics. For decades, national identities had been suppressed. Now suddenly, Glasnost allows people to speak openly. And you could literally identify long suppressed nationalism burst into the open. This is absolutely massive because now the USSR is simultaneously on multiple fronts, essentially fighting political crisis, economic crisis, and nationalism, rebellion, and the fueling of this phenomenon simultaneously, which was basically impossible to survive. And Eastern Europe breaking free. This is where everything absolutely goes south, sour, insane. For decades, communist governments in Eastern Europe survived because people knew one thing. If necessary, Moscow sends tanks. Like, for example, they sent into Budapest in November 1956, and also during the Prague Spring into Czechoslovakia in 1968. However, Gorbachev changed this. He refused to use force, and this is one of the most important turning points in the entire Cold War. When Gorbachev removed that threat, the cracks first appeared, then domino effect. Hungary, Poland, East Germany, Romania, Czechoslovakia. In Romania, we had the whole situation with Ceausescu, and communist regimes collapsed one after another, and the Soviet Union does nothing, which was historically speaking unbelievable because previous Soviet leaders would have already a long time ago absolutely intervened militarily. Now we get to the legendary moment, the Berlin Wall, November 1989. East Germans are protesting. The regime is in a state of panic. Government officials accidentally announce travel changes too early. And suddenly, the people flood the checkpoints. there is a resemblance, a practical demonstration of emotion and pure chaos perfectly, and then boom, the wall effectively opens. Families reunite after decades. The people cry and celebrate. They climb the wall, and symbolically, the Cold War is basically dead. This is one of the biggest significance arguments you could possibly use, because the Berlin Wall arguably was not just a wall. It symbolized communism, division, Soviet control, Cold War confrontation. Its collapse symbolized the collapse of Soviet authority itself. And if you analyze in such a way, this is essentially a star significance analysis. Now, why Reagan matters? This is a very important nuance. Did America cause the collapse? Cambridge absolutely adores, loves this debate. And this is called the triumphalist interpretation. The idea that Reagan defeated the USSR. Arguments for this are strategic defense initiative, Reagan coming in essentially guns blazing with huge military spending, pressure on the Soviet economy, aggressive anti communism. The USSR could not economically compete forever. But if you're going to be an A star student, you need to balance this. The Soviet Union had internal structural weaknesses long before Reagan. Reagan increased pressure, but the USSR collapsed mainly because its own system was failing internally. And this is exactly what Cambridge rewards. Not simplistic, America won, because this is too basic, bland, vague, shallow. And the final collapse comes in with this final boss battle, the 1991 coup attempt. Hardline communists panic, thinking that Gorbachev is destroying the USSR. So they attempt a coup. They imprison Gorbachev. Tanks roll into Moscow. And this is where Boris Yeltsin comes to the fore as the main character. Yeltsin could be described as standing against the coup and rallying resistance. Now here's where the insane part comes to fruition. The soldiers refuse to apply force onto civilians, and they refuse to crush them, fortunately. And this is the moment the Cold War and the Soviet system truly die. Because authoritarian systems survive through obedience. Once the army refuses, like it was with Milosevic in 2000, it's over. The coup collapses. The Communist Party is destroyed politically. Republics begin leaving the USSR. And then, the final straw. December 1991. The Soviet Union, on Christmas Day, 25th of December, officially ceases to exist. One of the two global superpowers disappears. Just gone. Vanished into thin air. Now, why did the Cold War end? Now, the actual exam question. This should be your A-star framework. You would need multiple factors and not one factor. Your factor should be something along the lines of Gorbachev's reforms, nationalism, economic stagnation in the USSR, failure in Afghanistan, which started in the late 1970s, Eastern European revolutions, Reagan and American pressure, collapse of communist legitimacy, failed August coup, and now rank them. This is what top students will do. Not describe, but make a judgment. Now, in terms of what could potentially be an A-star model answer judgment sort of thing, is the most important factor was Gorbachev's reforms because they unintentionally weakened the mechanisms of Soviet control and allowed existing economic, political, and nationalist problems to explode simultaneously. That is an A-star style argument. because it links multiple factors together. Examiner section now. How to get a star. If the question is, let's say, the example of why did the Cold War end in 1989, do not just narrate events. Cambridge hates chronology dumping. You do not want your essay to be merely just a list of facts. You need factor, evidence, analysis, judgment. An example of a bad answer is Gorbachev introduced glasnost. On the other hand, an example of a piece of prose which is likely to score into the top mark bands of the mark scheme is something along the lines of glasnost weakened Soviet ideological control by allowing open criticism of the regime which undermined the legitimacy upon which communist authority depended. That is the fundamental difference. Always virtually explain the impact. Always practically explain why. And be pragmatic and think like a historian and always explain significance. In terms of the small print, the bottom line, the USSR was weak before Gorbachev. There was economic stagnation, disaster in Afghanistan, glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring, the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, which showed the lies and the bureaucracy that were embedded within the system. Then we have nationalism exploding, Eastern Europe breaking free, Berlin Wall falling, Reagan pressuring the USSR, 1991 coup failing, Yeltsin rising, and the USSR collapsing. That should be your essay skeleton. And honestly, guys, this topic is one of the best in the syllabus because it genuinely feels cinematic. You literally watch fear disappear, walls collapsing, dictatorships panicking, an entire superpower imploding live on television. That is absolutely mental. And if this helped, please appreciate this video by dropping a like, share, and a subscribe. And next we can do the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, Korea, as well as full paper 4 essay plans. Take care, all the best, good luck, you've got this. I love you all, and see you in the next video. Cheers, bye bye.